7. Justice and equality. One condition of the ideal moral judgment is impartiality, understood as compliance with the formal principle of justice. That principle requires that all individuals be given their due, something we fail to do if similar individuals are treated dissimilarly. The principle is said to be a formal principle because by itself it does not specify what individuals are due. The principle implies only that, whatever this is, justice will not be done if, without being able to cite a morally relevant difference, individuals are treated differently. Justice, understood as a formal principle, obviously is not enough. Unless we have some reasonable basis for determining what individuals are due, we will lack principled grounds for deciding when two or more individuals are morally relevantly similar or dissimilar, and lacking this, we will also lack a principled basis for deciding what each is due as a matter of strict justice. Thus arrives the need to give a non-native interpretation of justice. Not surprisingly, there is no single interpretation or theory of justice. Such is the nature of competing theories in any discipline. It is not peculiar to moral philosophy. The disagreements that exist should not encourage us to believe that there is no rational way to separate the wheat from the chaff. Indeed, the overarching objective of the present chapter is to do just that. I shall proceed as follows. 3 interpretations of justice will be explained and critically assessed. 2 of the 3, perfectionism and utilitarianism, will be rejected, and the third, the equality of individuals, will be defended. This latter interpretation rests on postulating that certain individuals have a distinctive kind of value, inherent value, and both the nature of this value and the criteria for its attribution will be explained. These considerations will provide the basis for acceptance of the respect principle, a principle that stipulates a direct duty of justice owed to all those individuals who have inherent value. That principle, it will be argued, applies to our dealings with moral agents and moral patients, and applies equally since, for reasons offered in the sequel, moral agents and patients must be viewed as possessing equal inherent value. Attempts to dispense with the respect principle and the postulate of inherent value on which it rests, in particular the option offered by rule utilitarianism, will be considered and refuted. The respect principle will be defended as a valid moral principle, and the connection between that principle and the harm principle will be explained. 7.1. Utilitarian and perfectionist theories of justice. Though they were not called by this name, the previous chapter brought us in touch with alternative utilitarian interpretations of formal justice. Recall the importance utilitarians place on counting each for one, no one for more than one. That seems eminently just in spirit and intent, eminently egalitarian. No one individual is viewed as being more or less entitled to the same consideration accorded other relatively similar individuals. Now, it is fundamentally important to emphasize that equal consideration for utilitarians is a pre-distributive requirement. For hedonistic utilitarians, for example, individuals are treated equally, are treated as justice requires, if their pleasures and pains are considered and counted as equal in importance to the like pleasures and pains of any others. That is what every individual is due as a matter of justice, and those who are denied equal consideration and weighing of their equal pleasures given hedonistic utilitarianism may validly claim, or have claimed on their behalf, that they have been treated unjustly. I shall have a good deal more to say about utilitarian interpretations of justice in the present chapter. Utilitarianism is not the only normative interpretation of justice, and not all theories are as egalitarian as utilitarianism aspires to be. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle and the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, advanced perfectionist theories of justice, according to which what individuals are due as a matter of justice depends on the degree to which they possess a certain cluster of virtues or excellences, including intellectual and artistic talents and a character that expresses itself in the performance of heroic or magnificent deeds. Those who possess such virtues abundantly are due more as a matter of justice than those who possess them to a limited degree or not at all. It is, therefore, a short step from accepting a perfectionist theory of justice to allowing a highly differential treatment of individuals who differ in the extent to which they possess the virtues favored by such a theory. And it should come as no surprise that, enamored as he was by such a conception of justice, Aristotle, for example, thinks that some human beings are slaves by nature, are, as it were, born to be slaves. So bereft are they of even the minimum capacity for artistic, intellectual, and other virtues. Their function is to serve the higher, more deserving interests of the virtuous, for example, by carrying out such tasks as growing food and collecting refuse, tasks for which they are naturally suited by their intellectual and aesthetic poverty, work that relieves the virtuous of the need to spend their time in such low-level pursuits, and thus provides them with the leisure necessary to develop their artistic and intellectual virtues optimally. Nor can those consigned to serve their natural masters complain of a lack of justice. They get exactly what is their due, since a just society calls for arrangements that further the perfection of the virtuous. Those lacking the preferred virtues cannot complain of any injustice in being required to serve the needs of the artistic and intellectual elite. Perfectionist theories of justice are morally pernicious, providing as they do the foundation of the most objectionable forms of social, political, and legal discrimination, chattel slavery, rigid caste systems, and gross disparities in the quality of life available to citizens in the same state, for example. But perfectionist theories are objectionable at a deeper level. Whether individuals have the talent necessary to acquire the favored virtues, for example, ability to do higher mathematics, is beyond their control. What natural talents individuals have, to hearken back to a helpful phrase of Rawls's, is the result of the natural lottery. Those who are born with intellectual or artistic gifts have not themselves done anything to deserve preferred treatment, any more than those who are born lacking these gifts have done anything to deserve being denied those benefits essential to their welfare. No theory of justice can be adequate that builds justice on so fortuitous a foundation, one that could sanction forwarding the higher interests of some over the vital interests of others, even to the point where the latter could be enslaved by the former, thereby having their liberty and other benefits acutely diminished in the name of justice. Though consensus is a rare thing in the cloakrooms of philosophy, few, if any, philosophers today would defend a perfectionist theory of justice, for the reasons given, though not only for these. We shall have occasion to remind ourselves of the perils of perfectionism and the need to avoid them in the argument that follows. But it will also be suggested in a different context that considerations about the number and variety of one's abilities are morally relevant considerations in some unusual cases. Viewed against the backdrop of perfectionist theories of justice, Bentham's declaration about each counting for one, no one for more than one, must be perceived as a breath of fresh egalitarian air, and it is small wonder that this aspect of utilitarian philosophy was highly instrumental in bringing about many of the most important political, legal, and economic changes in the direction of a more egalitarian society, especially during the 19th century, especially in England. Though the actual consequences of the utilitarian push for equality are today viewed as commendable, the status of the equality principle in utilitarian theory is quite another matter, as was explained in the preceding chapter. Those arguments will not be aired here, though they will concern us later. Here I shall embark on offering an alternative interpretation of formal justice, one that is distinctly non-perfectionist and, though egalitarian, non-utilitarian. The ways in which the interpretation of justice favored here differs both from perfectionist and utilitarian theories of justice will be explained as we proceed. A defense of that interpretation must await its clear statement. 7.2. Individuals as equal in value. The interpretation of formal justice favored here, which will be referred to as equality of individuals, involves viewing certain individuals as having value in themselves. I shall refer to this kind of value as inherent value, and begin the discussion of it by first concentrating on the inherent value attributed to moral agents. The inherent value of individual moral agents is to be understood as being conceptually distinct from the intrinsic value that attaches to the experiences they have. For example, their pleasures or preference satisfactions, as not being reducible to values of this latter kind, and as being incommensurate with these values. To say that inherent value is not reducible to the intrinsic values of an individual's experiences means that we cannot determine the inherent value of individual moral agents by totaling the intrinsic values of their experiences. Those who have a more pleasant or happier life do not therefore have greater inherent value than those whose lives are less pleasant or happy, nor do those who have more cultivated preferences, say for arts and letters, therefore have greater inherent value. To say that the inherent value of individual moral agents is incommensurate with the intrinsic value of their or anyone else's experiences means that the two kinds of value are not comparable and cannot be exchanged one for the other. Like proverbial apples and oranges, the two kinds of value do not fall within the same scale of comparison. One cannot ask, how much intrinsic value is the inherent value of this individual worth? How much is it equal to? The inherent value of any given moral agent isn't equal to any sum of intrinsic values, neither the intrinsic value of that individual's experiences, nor the total of the intrinsic value of the experiences of all other moral agents. To view moral agents as having inherent value is thus to view them as something different from and something more than mere receptacles of what has intrinsic value. They have value in their own right, a value that is distinct from, not reducible to, and incommensurate with the values of those experiences which, as receptacles, they have or undergo. The difference between the utilitarian receptacle view of value regarding moral agents and the postulate of inherent value might be made clearer by recalling the cup analogy. On the receptacle view of value, it is what goes into the cup, the pleasures or preference satisfactions, for example, that has value. What does not have value is the cup itself, that is, the individual himself or herself. The postulate of inherent value offers an alternative. The cup, that is, the individual, has value and a kind that is not reducible to and is incommensurate with what goes into the cup, for example, pleasure. The cup, the individual, does contain, experience, things that are valuable, for example, pleasures. But the value of the cup, individual, is not the same as any one or any sum of the valuable things the cup contains. Individual moral agents themselves have a distinctive kind of value, according to the postulate of inherent value, but not according to the receptacle view to which utilitarians are committed. It's the cup, not just what goes into it, that is valuable. Two options present themselves concerning the possession by moral agents of inherent value. First, moral agents might be viewed as having this value to varying degrees, so that some may have more of it than others. Second, moral agents might be viewed as having this value equally. The latter view is rationally preferable. If moral agents are viewed as having inherent value to varying degrees, then there would have to be some basis for determining how much inherent value any given moral agent has. Theoretically, the basis could be claimed to be anything, such as wealth or belonging to the right race or sex. More likely, the basis might be claimed to be possession of certain virtues or excellences, such as those favored by Aristotle. On this latter, perfectionist account of inherent value, those who have abundant intellectual or artistic skills would have more inherent value than those who have some, and these latter individuals would have more than those who lack the virtues completely. To accept this view of the inherent value of moral agents is to pave the way for a perfectionist theory of justice. Those with less inherent value could justly be required to serve the needs and interests of those with more, even if it is not in the interests of those who serve to do so. And the subjugated could have no grounds to complain of the injustice of the treatment they receive. Because they have less inherent value, they would get what they deserve. Such an interpretation of justice is unacceptable. Equally unacceptable, therefore, is any view of the inherent value of moral agents that could serve as the basis of such a theory. We must reject the view that moral agents have inherent value in varying degrees. All moral agents are equal in inherent value if moral agents have inherent value. 3 corollaries of the conclusion just reached are worth noting. First, the inherent value of moral agents cannot be viewed as something they can earn by dint of their efforts, or as something they can lose by what they do or fail to do. A criminal is no less inherently valuable than a saint, if both are moral agents and if moral agents have inherent value. Second, the inherent value of moral agents cannot wax or wane depending upon the degree to which they have utility with respect to the interests of others. The most beneficent philanthropist is neither more nor less inherently valuable than, say, an unscrupulous used car salesman. Third, the inherent value of moral agents is independent of their being the object of anyone else's interests. When it comes to inherent value, it matters not whether one is liked, admired, respected, or in other ways valued by others. The lonely, forsaken, unwanted, and unloved are no more nor less inherently valuable than those who enjoy a more hospitable relationship with others. To view all moral agents as equal in inherent value is thus decidedly egalitarian and non-perfectionist. But why, it might be asked, should we prefer the view that all moral agents have equal inherent value over the egalitarianism associated with utilitarianism? Since both are equally egalitarian, why choose the postulate of inherent value, to give a name to the view being championed here, in preference to utilitarianism? This question concedes more to utilitarianism than is its due, since for reasons advanced in the previous chapter, it is unclear how, if at all, utilitarian theory can find room within itself to account for its version of equality. But there is a further difference between the implications of utilitarian theory and the postulate of inherent value, one that strengthens the latter as it weakens the former. Recall the unsavory moral implications of act utilitarianism, including, in particular, the utilitarian justification of secret killings of moral agents. For the act utilitarian, we are guilty of no injustice if we kill a moral agent, in order to bring about the best aggregate balance of good over evil for all concerned, assuming that everyone's interests were counted and weighed equitably. This approach to ethical judgment assumes that the only kind of value that falls within the scope of a concern for justice is the kind that, so to speak, goes into receptacles, for example, pleasant experiences. Given the postulate of inherent value, however, concern for justice must look to a different kind of value. If moral agents have inherent value, we cannot ignore that value when attempting to determine what treatment is just or unjust. In particular, since this kind of value is not the same as, is not reducible to, and is incommensurate with the kind of value that goes into receptacles, we cannot be treating a moral agent as justice requires if the justification is claimed to reside merely in the instrumentality of the act in bringing about the best aggregate balance of, say, pleasures over pains for all those affected by the outcome. No killing of a moral agent, then, whether done in secrecy or not, can be just if its justification assumes that moral agents are mere receptacles. This does not mean that it must always be wrong to kill a moral agent. What it means is that killing a moral agent cannot be in keeping with the requirements of justice if moral agents have inherent value and if the defense is an act utilitarian defense. A defense of that kind assumes that moral agents are mere receptacles. which, given the postulate of inherent value, they are not. That this postulate enables us to avoid the counterintuitive implications of act utilitarianism in the case of secret killings of moral agents must surely count as a point in favor of, rather than a point against, viewing moral agents as inherently valuable. Similar remarks apply to the possible justification of other harms done to moral agents by moral agents. To cause moral agents to suffer, or to deprive them of their liberty, for example, cannot be defended merely by appealing to the better balance of, say, pleasure over pain for all concerned. To suppose otherwise is, again, to assume that moral agents are merely receptacles of valuable experiences, and so may be treated in ways that optimize these values without the victims being treated unjustly. All that is required to ensure just treatment on utilitarian grounds is that the preferences, pleasures, etc., of all affected by the outcome be considered, and that equal preferences, pleasures, etc., be counted equally. But if moral agents have a value that is not reducible to or commensurate with the value of their own or everyone else's valuable experiences, then how moral agents are to be treated, if they are to be treated justly, cannot be determined merely by considering the desires and the like of all involved, weighting them equitably, and then favoring that option that will bring about the optimal balance of goods over evils for all involved. To suppose otherwise is to assume that questions of just treatment can be answered by ignoring the value of the individual moral agent, which, if moral agents are viewed as equal in inherent value, simply is not true. Moreover, because all moral agents are viewed as equal in inherent value, if any have such value, what applies to how some may be justly treated applies to all, whatever their race, say, or sex. Given the postulate of inherent value, no harm done to any moral agent can possibly be justified merely on the grounds of its producing the best consequences for all affected by the outcome. Thus are we able to avoid the counterintuitive implications of act utilitarianism if we deny the receptacle view of moral agents and postulate their equal inherent value. 7.3. All animals are equal. To this point, I have restricted my comments on inherent value to the inherent value of moral agents. It might be thought, and it is thought by some, most notably Kant, for reasons explained in an earlier chapter, that the notion of inherent value or some related idea, for example, conceiving of moral agents as ends in themselves, applies to all moral agents, and only to moral agents. But the attempt to restrict inherent value to moral agents is arbitrary. As we saw in the previous discussion of indirect duty views, any position that denies that we have direct duties to those moral patients with whom we have been and will continue to be concerned, normal mammalian animals aged 1 or more, and those human moral patients like these animals in the relevant respects, is rationally defective. Some of our duties regarding animals are duties we owe directly to them. Moreover, as was argued previously, some of the harms done to these moral patients are harms of the same kind as harms done to moral agents. We cannot consistently hold, therefore, that moral agents and patients can never be harmed in relevantly similar ways. They can. Thus, if we view all moral agents as having equal inherent value, if we rely on this account of the value of these individuals to avoid the counterintuitive implications of act utilitarianism, denying that the harm done to some moral agents can be justified merely on the grounds that harming them brings about optimal consequences for all concerned, if some of these harms done to moral agents are harms of the same kind as harms done to moral patients, and if the duties not to harm either moral agents or moral patients in these ways are prima facie duties owed directly to each, then it would be arbitrary to regard moral patients as lacking inherent value, or to suppose that they have the status of mere receptacles. If, in short, we postulate inherent value in the case of moral agents, then we cannot non-arbitrarily deny it of moral patients. Some might concede that moral patience must be viewed as having some inherent value if we postulate inherent value in the case of moral agents, but deny that the inherent value of moral patience is equal to that possessed by moral agents. But the grounds on which this could be argued will inevitably confuse the inherent value of individuals with A, the comparative value of their experiences, B, their possession of certain favored virtues, for example, intellectual or artistic excellences, C, their utility relative to the interests of others, or D, their being the object of another's interests. And this confusion will prove fatal to any attempt to defend the view that moral patients have less inherent value than moral agents. Since the inherent value of moral agents does not wax or wane depending on their comparative happiness or their total of pleasures over pains, it would be arbitrary to maintain that moral patients have less inherent value than moral agents because they, that is, moral patients, have less happy lives, or because their total of pleasures over pains is less than that of moral agents, even if this were true, which it may not be in some cases. Moreover, since one cannot suppose that moral agents have varying degrees of inherent value depending on the extent to which they possess some favored virtues or have varying utility with respect to the interests of others, without paving the way for the unjust treatment of those who have less by those who have more, treatment that would be allowed by discredited perfectionist theories of justice, one cannot non-arbitrarily maintain that how much inherent value moral patients have depends on the degrees to which they possess the virtues in question, or on how much utility for others they have. Morality will not tolerate the use of double standards when cases are relevantly similar. If we postulate inherent value in the case of moral agents and recognize the need to view their possession of it as being equal, then we will be rationally obliged to do the same in the case of moral patients. All who have inherent value thus have it equally, whether they be moral agents or moral patients. All animals are equal when the notions of animal and equality are properly understood, animal referring to all, terrestrial at least, moral agents and patients, and equality referring to their equal possession of inherent value. Inherent value is thus a categorical concept. One either has it or one does not. There are no in-betweens. Moreover, all those who have it equally. It does not come in degrees. 7.4. Inherent value and reverence for life. Those who, like Kant, restrict inherent value to moral agents limit this value to those individuals who have those abilities essential for moral agency, in particular, the ability to bring impartial reasons to bear on one's decision-making. The conception of inherent value involved in the postulate of inherent value is more Catholic, applying to individuals, for example, human moral patients, who lack the abilities necessary for moral agency. If moral agents and moral patients, despite their differences, are viewed as having equal inherent value, then it is not unreasonable to demand that we cite some relevant similarity between them that makes attributing inherent value to them intelligible and non-arbitrary. In the nature of the case, this similarity cannot be something that varies from individual to individual, since that would allow their inherent value to vary accordingly. Thus, no physical characteristic, for example, having 2 eyes or 5 fingers, can mark the relevant similarity, nor will species membership suffice, for example, belonging to the species Canis lupus or Homo sapiens. Nor will still more general biological classifications do, for example, being an animal. One characteristic shared by all moral agents and those moral patients with whom we are concerned is that they are alive, and some thinkers evidently believe that it is the possession of this characteristic that marks off the class of individuals who have inherent value from those who do not. Albert Schweitzer is perhaps the most famous thinker whose position invites this interpretation, and his famous ethic of reverence for life enjoys wide currency in many public discussions of how we ought to live, not only regarding how we ought to treat one another in our reciprocal relationships as moral agents, but also regarding how we ought to treat other living things, including moral patients. But there are problems concerning both the scope and precision of Schweitzer's principle, some of which Schweitzer himself, perhaps unwittingly, exposes without resolving in the following passage. True philosophy must commence with the most immediate and comprehensive facts of consciousness, and this may be formulated as follows. I am life which wills to live, and I exist in the midst of life which wills to live. Just as in my own will to live there is a yearning for moral life, and for that mysterious exaltation of the will which is called pleasure, and terror in face of annihilation, and that injury to the will to live which is called pain, so the same obtains in all the will to live around me, equally whether it can express itself to my comprehension or whether it remains unvoiced. Ethics thus consists in this, that I experience the necessity of practicing the same reverence for life toward all will to live as toward my own. Therein I have already the needed fundamental principle of morality. It is good to maintain and cherish life. It is evil to destroy and to check life. A man is really ethical only when he obeys the constraint laid on him to help all life which he is able to succor, and when he goes out of his way to avoid injuring anything living. He does not ask how far this or that life deserves sympathy as valuable in itself, nor how far it is capable of feeling. To him, life as such is sacred. He shatters no ice crystal that sparkles in the sun, tears no leaf from its tree, breaks off no flower, and is careful not to crush any insect as he walks. If he works by lamplight on a summer evening, he prefers to keep the window shut and to breathe stifling air, rather than to see insect after insect fall on his table with singed and stinking wings. Among the many things that are unclear in this passage is why those who are enjoined to have reverence for all life should take care not to shatter an ice crystal, since there is no clear sense in which ice crystals are alive or exhibit will to live. That ice crystals may be beautiful, and that conscientious sojourners would not needlessly destroy their beauty or the beauty of non-living nature generally, is arguable, though not easily. But if we are enjoined not to destroy the beauty of the natural order, even when the object of beauty is not alive, then we are in need of a more general principle than that of reverence for all life. More importantly, reliance on a more general principle will imply that being alive is not a necessary condition of someone's having inherent value, with the result that the ethic of reverence for life will not be the sole fundamental principle its champions imply that it is. In reply to these difficulties, it might be suggested that being alive is a sufficient condition of an individual's having inherent value. This position would avoid the problems indigenous to the view that being alive is a necessary condition, but it stands in need of quite considerable analysis and argument if it is to win the day. It is not clear why we have, or why we reasonably could be said to have, direct duties to, say, individual blades of grass, potatoes, or cancer cells. Yet all are alive, and so all should be owed direct duties if all have inherent value. Nor is it clear why we have, or how we reasonably could be said to have, direct duties to collections of such individuals, to lawns, potato fields, or cancerous tumors. If, in reply to these difficulties, we are told that we have direct duties only to some but not to all living things, and that it is this subclass of living things whose members have inherent value, then not only will we stand in need of a way to distinguish those living things that have this value from those that do not, but more importantly for present purposes, the view that being alive is a sufficient condition of having such value will have to be abandoned. Because of the difficulties endemic both to the view that being alive is a necessary condition of having inherent value, and to the view that this is a sufficient condition, and granting that moral agents and moral patients share the important characteristic of being alive, it is extremely doubtful that the case could be made for viewing this similarity as the relevant similarity they share, by virtue of which all moral agents and patients have equal inherent value. 7.5. Inherent value and the subject of a life criterion. An alternative to viewing being alive as the relevant similarity is what will be termed the subject of a life criterion. To be the subject of a life, in the sense in which this expression will be used, involves more than merely being alive and more than merely being conscious. To be the subject of a life is to be an individual whose life is characterized by those features explored in the opening chapters of the present work. That is, individuals are subjects of a life if they have beliefs and desires, perception, memory, and a sense of the future, including their own future, an emotional life together with feelings of pleasure and pain, preference and welfare interests, the ability to initiate action in pursuit of their desires and goals, a psychophysical identity over time, and an individual welfare in the sense that their experiential life fares well or ill for them, logically independently of their utility for others and logically independently of their being the object of anyone else's interests. Those who satisfy the subject of a life criterion themselves have a distinctive kind of value, inherent value, and are not to be viewed or treated as mere receptacles. The claim that the value of those individuals who satisfy this criterion is logically independent of their utility for and the interests of others must be kept distinct from and not confused with the obvious fact that the welfare of those who satisfy this criterion is causally related to their perceived utility and the interests of others. Actively to harm either a moral agent or patient, for example, to cause either gratuitous suffering, is to do something that causally detracts from their individual welfare, just as actively to benefit either, for example, by providing either with the opportunity to pursue their desires when it is in their interests to do so, is prima facie to contribute to their welfare, especially in the case of human moral patients, individuals who, because of a variety of conditions, are incapable to varying degrees of taking care of themselves. How they fare in life is to a very considerable degree causally dependent on what we do to them or for them. For example, young children and the mentally enfeebled of all ages lack the requisite knowledge, and sometimes even the requisite physical abilities to satisfy even their most basic needs and correlative desires. If we do not act on their behalf, they will fare ill. But even in the case of these individuals, their having a welfare, their being the experiencing subject of a life that fares well or ill for them, logically independently of their utility for us, or of our taking an interest in them, this fact about them is not causally dependent on what we do to or for them. Indeed, the very possibility of our doing anything that affects their experiential welfare, for good or ill, presupposes that they are the experiencing subjects of such a life, on their own, as it were. And the same is true both of those moral patients, for example, animals in the wild, who can take care of themselves without the need of human intervention, and of those humans who are moral agents. Though what we, as moral agents, do to each other causally affects how we fare during the course of our individual lives, that we are the subjects of such a life is not similarly causally dependent on what others do to or for us. We have this status in the world, as do moral patients, whether human or animal, on our own. Having this status is, logically, part of what it is for us or them to be in the world. The subject of a life criterion identifies a similarity that holds between moral agents and patients. Is this similarity a relevant similarity, one that makes viewing them as inherently valuable, intelligible, and non-arbitrary? The grounds for replying affirmatively are as follows. 1. A relevant similarity among all those who are postulated to have equal inherent value must mark a characteristic shared by all those moral agents and patients who are here viewed as having such value. The subject of a life criterion satisfies this requirement. All moral agents and all those moral patients with whom we are concerned are subjects of a life that is better or worse for them, in the sense explained, logically independently of the utility they have for others, and logically independently of their being the object of the interests of others. Since inherent value is conceived to be a categorical value, admitting of no degrees, any supposed relevant similarity must itself be categorical. The subject of a life criterion satisfies this requirement. This criterion does not assert or imply that those who meet it have the status of subject of a life to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the degree to which they have or lack some favored ability or virtue, for example, the ability for higher mathematics, or those virtues associated with artistic excellence. One either is a subject of a life, in the sense explained, or one is not. All those who are so equally. The subject of a life criterion thus demarcates a categorical status shared by all moral agents and those moral patients with whom we are concerned. 3. A relevant similarity between moral agents and patients must go some way toward illuminating why we have direct duties to both, and why we have less reason to believe that we have direct duties to individuals who are neither moral agents nor patients, even including those who, like moral agents, and those patients we have in mind, are alive. This requirement also is satisfied by the subject of a life criterion. Not all living things are subjects of a life, in the sense explained. Thus, not all living things are to be viewed as having the same moral status, given this criterion, and the differences concerning our confidence about having direct duties to some, those who are subjects, and our not having direct duties to others, those who are not subjects, can be at least partially illuminated, because the former meet, while the latter fail to meet, the subject of a life criterion. For these reasons, the subject of a life criterion can be defended as citing a relevant similarity between moral agents and patients, one that makes the attribution of equal inherent value to them both intelligible and non-arbitrary. 3 further points require our attention before turning to the task of articulating and defending the principle of justice grounded in the notion of inherent value. First, though satisfying the subject of a life criterion marks a relevant similarity, one that makes the attribution of inherent value to moral agents and patients both intelligible and non-arbitrary, the claim has not been made, nor does anything said in the above imply, that satisfying this criterion is a necessary condition of having inherent value. It may be that there are individuals, or possibly collections of individuals, that though they are not subjects of a life in the sense explained, nevertheless have inherent value, have, that is, a kind of value that is conceptually distinct from, is not reducible to, and is incommensurate with such values as pleasure or preference satisfaction. The issues here are extremely complicated. As I have argued elsewhere, the very possibility of developing a genuine ethic of the environment as distinct from an ethic for its use turns on the possibility of making the case that natural objects, though they do not meet the subject of a life criterion, can nonetheless have inherent value. Attempts to show that this is conceptually absurd are inconclusive at best, while attempts to show that postulating inherent value in natural objects or collections of such objects, though intelligible, is unnecessary, suffer from a similar fate. Nevertheless, it is extraordinarily difficult to give an intelligible account of inherent value in this connection. For example, though criteria can be given regarding when, say, an oak tree is good of its kind, that is, good as an oak tree, and though these criteria are not dependent on a good oak tree's having utility for others, or being the object of anybody's interests, an oak tree's being good of its kind by itself has no more moral significance than, say, a cancer cell's or a murderer's being good of their kind. And the same applies to collections of oak trees, or cancer cells or murderers. Those who would work out a genuine ethic of the environment in terms of the inherent value of natural objects, trees, rivers, rocks, etc., or of collections of such objects, are not logically debarred from undertaking the task by anything said or implied in these pages, since the subject of a life criterion is set forth as a sufficient, not as a necessary condition of making the attribution of inherent value intelligible and non-arbitrary. While no one is denied the possibility of working out such an ethic, however, those who aspire to do it certainly have their work cut out for them. For further remarks on environmental ethics, see 9.3. Second, and relatedly, the argument of the present section does not logically preclude the possibility that those humans and animals who fail to meet the subject of a life criterion nonetheless have inherent value. Since the claim is made only that meeting this criterion is a sufficient condition of making the attribution of inherent value intelligible and non-arbitrary, it remains possible that animals that are conscious but not capable of acting intentionally, or, say, permanently comatose human beings, might nonetheless be viewed as having inherent value. As in the case of non-conscious natural objects or collections of such objects, however, it must be said that it is radically unclear how the attribution of inherent value to these individuals can be made intelligible and non-arbitrary. The difficulties alluded to in the earlier discussion of viewing being alive as either a necessary or sufficient condition of having such value may be taken as illustrative of the kind of difficulty one is likely to encounter in this quarter. It may be that animals, for example, which, though conscious and sentient, that is, capable of experiencing pleasure and pain, lack the ability to remember, to act purposively, or to have desires or form beliefs, can only properly be viewed as receptacles of what has intrinsic value, lacking any value in their own right. One should avoid being doctrinaire on this point. In any event, the attempt to resolve these issues is well beyond the scope of the present work, and so, as in the case of exploring the foundations of an environmental ethic, marks a point at which it is incomplete. For further observations on this matter, see 9.3. This incompleteness does not infect the adequacy of the subject of a life criterion, however, when this is understood as a sufficient condition in the sense explained, nor does it undermine the claim that normal mammalian animals, aged 1 or more, as well as humans like these animals in the relevant respects, can intelligibly and non-arbitrarily be viewed as having inherent value. Third, it is important to emphasize that the preceding argument in support of the subject of a life criterion does not commit the naturalistic fallacy, the view, very roughly speaking, that it is a fallacy to infer values from facts. The position argued for in the above cannot fairly be reduced to the following. Premise 1. Some individuals are the subjects of a life that fares well or ill for them, logically independently of their utility for others, or of their being the object of another's interests, a fact. Conclusion 2. Therefore, these individuals have inherent value, a value. The present work is not the proper occasion to address the question, is the naturalistic fallacy a fallacy? Whether it is or not, the argument of the preceding pages is considerably more complicated than the movement from premise 1 to conclusion 2 would suggest. To view certain individuals, for example moral agents, as having equal inherent value is a postulate, that is, a theoretical assumption. As befits any theoretical assumption, however, it is not one made without reason. On the contrary, it is an assumption that vies with alternative theories about the value of moral agents, in particular the views that they lack value in their own right and are only receptacles of experiences that are valuable in themselves, the utilitarian view, or that they have value in their own right, but a kind of value that varies from individual to individual, depending upon the possession of favored virtues, the perfectionist view. And there are reasons for accepting this postulate. To postulate that moral agents have equal inherent value provides a theoretical basis for avoiding the wildly inegalitarian implications of perfectionist theories, on the one hand, and, on the other, the counterintuitive implications of all forms of act utilitarianism. For example, that secret killings that optimize the aggregate consequences for all affected by the outcome are justified. The role of the subject of a life criterion must be viewed, if it is to be viewed fairly, against this larger background. The reasons we have for postulating equal inherent value for all moral agents and patients are logically distinct from that criterion. That criterion is introduced after we have indicated the reasons for postulating that moral agents and patients have equal inherent value, not before. Thus, its role is not to derive the equal inherent value of moral agents or of moral patients. Rather, its role is to specify a relevant similarity among all those individuals who, by force of argument, are to be viewed as having equal inherent value, if we postulated in the case of all moral agents, a similarity that makes the attribution of inherent value to them intelligible and non-arbitrary. Reasons have been advanced in the preceding for regarding the subject of a life criterion as equal to this task. To characterize the argument of the previous pages as amounting to the inference from premise 1 to conclusion 2, therefore, is not to characterize that argument, it is to caricature it. 7.6. Justice, the principle of respect for individuals. The view that moral agents and moral patients have equal inherent value is not itself a moral principle, since it does not itself enjoin us to treat these individuals in one way or another. In particular, the postulate of inherent value does not itself provide us with an interpretation of the formal principle of justice, the principle, it will be recalled, that requires that we give each individual his or her due. Still, that postulate does provide us with a basis for offering such an interpretation. If individuals have equal inherent value, then any principle that declares what treatment is due them as a matter of justice must take their equal value into account. The following principle, the respect principle, does this. We are to treat those individuals who have inherent value in ways that respect their inherent value. Now, the respect principle sets forth an egalitarian, non-perfectionist interpretation of formal justice. The principle does not apply only to how we are to treat some individuals having inherent value, for example, those with artistic or intellectual virtues. It enjoins us to treat all those individuals having inherent value in ways that respect their value, and thus it requires respectful treatment of all who satisfy the subject of a life criterion. Whether they are moral agents or patients, we must treat them in ways that respect their equal inherent value. In its present form, however, the respect principle lacks the precision it is reasonable to require of a moral principle. It does not specify what respect for such value requires. Some general comments in this regard may now be offered. To put matters in their most general negative form first, we may say that we fail to treat individuals who have inherent value with the respect they are due as a matter of strict justice whenever we treat them as if they lacked inherent value, and we treat them in this way whenever we treat them as if they were mere receptacles of valuable experiences, for example, pleasure or preference satisfaction, or as if their value depended upon their utility relative to the interests of others. In particular, therefore, we fail to display proper respect for those who have inherent value whenever we harm them, so that we may bring about the best aggregate consequences for everyone affected by the outcome of such treatment. The grounds for claiming that such treatment is disrespectful and unjust should be apparent. It can hardly be just or respectful to harm individuals who have inherent value merely in order to secure the best aggregate consequences for everyone affected by the outcome. This cannot be respectful of inherent value, because it is to view the individual who is harmed merely as a receptacle of what has value, for example, pleasure, so that the losses of such value credited to the harmed individual can be made up for, or more than compensated, by the sum of the gains in such values by others, without any wrong having been done to the loser. Individuals who have inherent value, however, have a kind of value that is distinct from, is not reducible to, and is incommensurate with such values as pleasure or preference satisfaction, either their own or those of others. To harm such individuals merely in order to produce the best consequences for all involved is to do what is wrong, is to treat them unjustly, because it fails to respect their inherent value. To borrow part of a phrase from Kant, individuals who have inherent value must never be treated merely as means to securing the best aggregate consequences. The respect principle, as a principle of justice, requires more than that we not harm some so that optimific results may be produced for all affected by the outcome. It also imposes the prima facie duty to assist those who are the victims of injustice at the hands of others. This is not peculiar to the present interpretation of formal justice. All initially plausible ethical theories recognize both the duty not to act unjustly oneself, as well as the duty to assist those who are the victims of injustice at the hands of others. Justice, that is, not only imposes duties of non-harm, it also imposes duties of assistance, understood as the duty to aid those who suffer from injustice. All individuals who have inherent value are to be given their due, and sometimes what they are due is our assistance. I shall return to this topic in the sequel. Like utilitarian interpretations of formal justice, the interpretation provided by the respect principle is not a principle of distributive justice. Neither it nor they lay down conditions that must be met if the distribution of benefits, goods, and harms, evils, arising as the result of a given act or rule are just distributions. In opposition to utilitarian interpretations, however, the interpretation of justice in terms of respect for individuals having inherent value rules out in advance the permissibility of arriving at any distribution in certain ways. No individual who has inherent value may justly be treated as a mere receptacle in order to secure optimal consequences for all affected by the outcome. How the benefits are distributed among the beneficiaries is irrelevant to assessing the injustice involved in securing them. Thus, while both utilitarian interpretations of equality and the respect principle are pre-distributive principles, the two differ fundamentally in what they can allow, something that will become increasingly clear as we proceed. 7.7. Rule utilitarianism and justice. The objections raised against utilitarianism in the previous chapter and the contrast drawn between utilitarianism and the interpretation of formal justice favored in the present one have focused on act utilitarianism. As was mentioned in the initial survey of utilitarian theory, not all utilitarians are act utilitarians. Some are rule utilitarians. The latter hold that the rightness or wrongness of a given act is to be determined by its conforming or failing to conform to a valid moral rule. And rules are said to be valid according to rule utilitarianism if, roughly speaking, general observance of them promotes the overreaching utilitarian goal of bringing about the best aggregate consequences for all affected by the outcome. The same kind of dispute about what counts as the best consequences that divide act utilitarians plays a similarly divisive role among rule utilitarians, so that there are rule utilitarians who are hedonists, some who are preference utilitarians, and so forth. As important as this dispute is, the differences that separate rule utilitarians from one another go beyond what does or does not have intrinsic value. Some rule utilitarians argue for ideal rule utilitarianism, a position that regards rules as valid if everybody's following them would yield the best consequences, even though there is little chance that many people will. Others argue for non-ideal utilitarian visions of morality, contenting themselves with asking what rules it is reasonable to believe that most people will normally follow, or at least will normally think should be followed. and still others offer yet different interpretations of the rules that, as utilitarians, they seek to validate. For reasons too apparent to need reciting, it will not be possible to assess all varieties of rule utilitarianism. It must be sufficient for now to indicate why rule utilitarianism, of whatever form, has seemed to some utilitarians to be preferable to act utilitarianism, how a rule utilitarian might respond to the objections I have raised against act utilitarianism, and how a rule utilitarian could dispute the necessity of postulating inherent value and of formulating a principle of justice that relies on this postulate. Then I shall indicate why, despite the apparent strengths of rule utilitarianism, its claims to adequacy are more shadow than substance. Consider the case of killings done in secret. The act utilitarian, it has been argued, is committed to permitting such killings if they bring about a better total balance of intrinsic good over evil for those affected by the outcome. That the victim loses a lot, indeed loses everything, is no cause for moral alarm, nor can it be the occasion for cries of injustice if his interests, pleasures, etc., were considered and counted equally with the like interests, pleasures, etc., of others. The rule utilitarian will protest. The rule against killing, thou shalt not kill, or it is wrong to kill, is a valid moral rule, and its validity does not mysteriously vanish when killings are done in secrecy, or when the killers reap a harvest of intrinsic values for themselves, goods that more than compensate for the loss on the victim's part. Since this rule is valid, and since killing in secrecy, even if it brings about the best consequences for all those affected by the outcome, is not a valid exception to it, killing in self-defense, for example, might be, those who kill in such circumstances do what is wrong, the rule utilitarian will aver, and the wrongness of their act can be accounted for by utilitarianism after all, by rule utilitarianism, that is. Now, the grounds for denying the permissibility of such acts, the rule utilitarian can contend, do not require that we either postulate that certain individuals have inherent value or offer interpretations of justice in terms of giving those who have such value the respect they are due. The immorality of harming any moral agent, for example, whether by killing her or by making her suffer, merely to optimize the best aggregate consequences, is nicely accommodated for by appeal to valid moral rules against harming anyone in these ways, the validity of these rules resting on the utility of having them. Rule utilitarianism, therefore, is a simpler theory than any theory that postulates that certain individuals have inherent value, its advocates will claim, since it can account for what its competitor accounts for without making the additional, unnecessary assumption that some individuals have inherent value. And since, other things being equal, the simpler theory should be chosen, utilitarianism wins the day. There are familiar objections to rule utilitarianism. For example, whether in its non-ideal forms it is at bottom indistinguishable from act utilitarianism, and so heir to all the objections that confront that version, and whether in its ideal forms it really is a form of utilitarianism at all. We will bypass these objections on the present occasion. There are other, less familiar but no less damaging criticisms of rule utilitarianism that will concern us. The view that we have direct duties to moral patience has been defended in an earlier chapter. If a moral theory is to be adequate, it must provide a credible account of these duties. Rule utilitarianism fails in this regard. Granted, if we concede the equality principle to rule utilitarians, a large assumption, it should be noted, they will be in a position to hold that the interests, pleasures, etc., of moral patience must be considered and counted equally with the like interests, pleasures, etc., of any other individual, including moral agents. But this, as we have seen, is a pre-distributive requirement that by itself in no way guarantees that we will have any of the same direct duties to moral patients that we have to moral agents, over and above considering their respective interests and counting them equally. Whether we are obliged on rule utilitarian grounds not to harm moral patients, as we are on that view, let us grant not to harm moral agents, must depend on whether there are distinctively utilitarian grounds for recognizing a rule setting forth a direct duty against harming the former. The rule utilitarian fails to show that we have such duties to moral patients. In the case of the rule against harming moral agents, what the rule utilitarian can argue is the following. If we were to accept rules that allowed that some moral agents could be harmed in certain ways, while other moral agents would be protected in this respect, then those persons who belonged to the victimized group would naturally feel resentful and envious, feelings that Hare remarks are disagreeable states of mind which lead people to do disagreeable things. To allow rules that foster and encourage envy and resentment and the disagreeable things these feelings give rise to is hardly conducive to promoting the best consequences for all involved. And it is arguable, though not easily, that a rule utilitarian could object to the adoption of rules that permit harming some moral agents, but not others, because of the consequences for, and brought into being by, those moral agents not covered by the rule. This kind of argument, let us call this the argument from envy, simply is not available to the rule utilitarian when the individuals at issue are moral patients, whether animals or human moral patients like these animals in the relevant respects. To feel envy over how some are treated or resentment about one's own situation because moral rules sanction preferred treatment for others presupposes that one is able to take stock of how the parties involved are treated, recognize the difference in the treatment they receive as a result of the rules, and, as a consequence of this realization, feel envious or resentful. Moral agents can do this. Moral patients cannot. The latter simply lack the intellectual sophistication to do so. They may be treated wrongly as a result of certain rules, but no one will claim that they can or will recognize their treatment as wrong because of these rules. Neither, then, is it plausible to maintain that they will feel the envy or resentment attending this recognition in the case of moral agents. Similarly deficient are appeals to so-called diminishing marginal utility. Almost always, Hare writes, if money or goods are taken away from someone who has a lot of them already and given to someone who has little, total utility is increased, other things being equal. In the case of the distribution of money to moral patients, what Hare claims is, strictly speaking, false. If we give money or other comparable goods to moral patients, there is no reason to believe that total utility will be increased, and very good reason to believe that just the reverse will transpire. Lacking as these individuals are in those capacities that would enable them to appreciate the use they can make of money relative to their own interests, there is no reason to believe that they would, and good reason to believe that they would not, make use of their financial windfall in ways that increase their own interests, and thereby increase total utility. To put money and other comparable goods in the hands of a chimpanzee or a young child won't serve the cause of maximizing utility. In response, it can be said that of course we are not to give money and other comparable goods directly to moral patients. Rather, we are to distribute these goods to other competent humans in whose care moral patients are entrusted. It is in this way we may be asked to believe that we can optimize total utility and thereby provide the needed basis for a rule against harming moral patients. The money used to provide them with the opportunities to satisfy their desires or fulfill their purposes is of greater utility than the comparable sums we might spend in pursuit of other desires or purposes. This response begs all the important empirical questions that, in the nature of the case, rule utilitarians must answer. What would be the consequences, all considered, if money and other comparable goods were distributed in this way? And how would these consequences fare in comparison with the total consequences that would result if we decided against such a distribution? Unless we know this, it is arbitrary to assume that a rule against harming moral patients, many of whom permanently lack the ability to promote utility by what they do, what contribution to the general welfare can the senile make, can be defended by appeal to declining marginal utility. For it might be that the harms done to these individuals, if we decided not to recognize a rule against harming all or some of them, would be more than offset by the benefits others could thereby obtain. For example, might not the consequences be better, all considered, if we allowed scientific research on morons? In order to take a principled position on this matter, when one's position turns on considerations about the comparative total consequences of our recognizing or not recognizing such a rule, one needs the relevant empirical questions answered, and answered in detail. As is almost always the case, recall the earlier criticism of Singer on a similar point in 6.4, the utilitarian does not have the necessary details at hand, and this serves his position ill. Appeals to declining marginal utility can only be as forceful as knowledge of the facts allows. Where knowledge gives way to speculation, these appeals lose their force. Even allowing that appeals to declining marginal utility may carry the day for the utilitarian in some contexts, they are weak and ineffective in the present one. How, then, can the rule utilitarian account for our having a direct, prima facie duty not to harm moral patients? One reply that, as it were, has always been in the wings, might now be thrust to center stage. Though moral patients cannot feel envy or resentment as a result of discriminatory rules, which makes the argument from envy inapplicable in their case, other individuals, it might be argued, will most certainly be angered and outraged were we not to recognize a rule against harming moral patients. The parents, relatives, and friends of human moral patients, for example, will certainly feel this way, and those who labor for the better treatment of animals will have comparable feelings in response to those speciesist practices the absence of this rule would allow. Now, these feelings, like those of envy and resentment, are disagreeable, and are likely to lead these people to do disagreeable things. Things that, were they to become common, as they would, let us assume, if we failed to recognize the rule in question, would most certainly be detrimental to optimizing overall aggregate utility. In this way, then, it might be argued the necessary utilitarian backing for recognizing a rule against harming moral patients is provided and is supported by as much empirical certainty as it is reasonable to require on the part of the utilitarian. Moral agents will behave badly because they will be angered and outraged if we fail to protect moral patients by having a rule against harming them. We know this. It is not mere speculation. This response, however plausible it may seem, simply will not do. It has the effect of transforming our direct prima facie duty not to harm moral patients into an indirect duty. We are to recognize a rule against harming moral patients, according to this reply, not because of the harm done directly to them, nor because of the harm they will do to others as a result, but because of the adverse consequences that would obtain for and as a result of the actions of others, parents, friends, etc., if we did not recognize such a rule. For reasons advanced at length in the critical discussion of indirect duty views in Chapter 5, the duty not to harm moral patients is a direct duty we have to them, and the adequacy of any theory stands or falls depending on whether and, if so, how well it can account for this direct duty. The rule utilitarians having recourse to the last reply is symptomatic of that theory's failure to meet this requirement. The critical discussion of rule utilitarianism to this point can be summed up by posing the following dilemma. 1. If rule utilitarians affirm that there is a moral rule against harming moral patients, a rule that generates a direct duty not to harm them, then they fail to ground this rule either by appealing to the argument from envy, moral patients cannot feel envious or resentful because of rules that discriminate against them and favor others, or by appealing to declining marginal utility, an appeal that will beg all the essential empirical questions. Nor can they ground this rule merely by appealing to the harms moral patients endure, for example, suffering, since the very question at issue is whether we ought to recognize a direct duty not to harm these individuals, judged on rule utilitarian grounds, and it is an open question, so far as rule utilitarianism is concerned, whether having such a rule would or would not serve to bring about gains on the part of others that more than compensate for the losses on the part of the moral patients who are harmed. What other fact, then, about moral patients themselves, if not their envy and the disagreeable deeds this would give rise to on their part, could provide a utilitarian reason for recognizing a direct duty against harming them? None comes readily to mind, and though the preceding discussion does not conclusively prove that no such fact can be found, the onus of proof is certainly on the rule utilitarian to find one. Unless or until he does, and it is fair to say that it is most unlikely that he will, the attempt to ground a rule against harming moral patients on the disutility that results from what they will feel or what they will do as a result of being harmed seems certain to prove inefficacious. That is the first horn of the rule utilitarian's dilemma. The second one is this. 2. If in the face of the grave difficulties just summarized, rule utilitarians have recourse to the disagreeable mental states that would be produced in the minds of others, for example, parents, if we were not to recognize a rule that generated a duty not to harm moral patients, for example, children, then the rule utilitarian would have a utilitarian reason for having such a rule. But the duty that the rule generated could no longer be regarded as a direct duty owed to moral patients. Now, since the case has been made that we have direct duties to moral patients, the rule utilitarian must avoid two at all costs. Accordingly, the adequacy of rule utilitarianism stands or falls on how well it can account for our having a direct prima facie duty not to harm moral patients. In the view of the reasons offered in 1, we have very strong reasons indeed for denying that it can pass this test. Rule utilitarianism lacks the wherewithal to ground direct duties owed to moral patients. Rule utilitarians might reply to this dilemma by contesting our earlier arguments against indirect duty views, especially those parts of that argument that involve appeals to our intuitions. What one wants, these utilitarians might say, echoing Singer's words, is a sound theory against which to test our intuitions, not a proliferation of appeals to our intuitions as a way to test the soundness of a theory. This sounds very well and good, but the burden of proof, it will be recalled, is on those who proclaim it to show that what they want done can be done. Can we get a sound theory without appealing to our reflective intuitions? This brings us to a final set of objections to rule utilitarianism, when that theory is assumed to stand on its own, as it were, immune to criticisms of it based on appeals to reflective intuitions. Recall the difficulties posed for utilitarians in the previous chapter, when they are asked to explain the status of the equality principle. Depending on the theory of value advanced by any given utilitarian, the equality principle will require that intrinsic goods, for example, preference satisfactions or pleasures, be considered, no matter whose they are, and that equal weighting be observed, that is, equal pleasures or preferences are to be counted equally. But what can be the status of the equality principle within any version of rule utilitarianism? It cannot be a fundamental moral principle, since the principle of utility, and that principle alone, is supposed to have this status. Nor can it be a derivative moral principle, a valid rule, since the equality or inequality of pleasures, preferences, interests, etc. cannot depend on the utility of weighing them as equal or unequal. The equality principle, in short, cannot have the status of a moral principle or rule within rule utilitarian theory. Neither can it have the status of a formal principle, a principle that must be met if any putative moral principle is to qualify as a genuine moral principle. The respect principle has the status of a moral principle, and yet it does not enjoin us to count equal preferences, pleasures, and so forth equally. At the very most, the equality principle, as understood by rule utilitarians, can have the status of a conditional formal principle, one that we must accept if, starting with our own individual interests, pleasures, and so on, we then take the moral point of view. As was noted in the earlier discussion, however, this argument could at most establish that those who begin to do their ethical thinking from the point of view of their own self-interest would commit themselves to a consequentialist principle. The validity of utilitarianism, the view that the principle of utility is the sole moral basis of morality, does not follow. Rule utilitarians, therefore, cannot rely on our assured acceptance of the conditional equality principle, as they understand it, to secure our commitment to utilitarianism. Moreover, and for present purposes more fundamentally, some reason must be given as to why we should begin thinking about what is moral or immoral from the vantage point of our individual self-interest. Why begin there, after all? Certainly, a compelling reason would be at hand if it could be shown that, starting from this point, we reach a sound moral theory. But for reasons just adduced for a second time, if one starts from one's own self-interest, one does not reach, that is, one is not committed to, the principle of utility as the one and only valid moral principle. So the burden of showing why we should, not simply that we might, begin to do our ethical thinking by starting with our own self-interest must be shouldered by those who advocate this as the place to begin. That burden has not been adequately borne by those who would have us start there, not by Narvissonian rational egoists, not by Rawlsian original contractors, and not by preference or other utilitarians. Just as in our earlier discussion of the equality principle and act utilitarianism, therefore, my present finding is that rule utilitarians cannot extract a commitment from us to accept utilitarianism, even were we to accept the conditional equality principle. More on this point in a moment. To claim that, when compared with any theory that involves postulating inherent value, rule utilitarianism is simpler and therefore preferable, is to assume the greater part of what rule utilitarians must show, namely, that their theory is at least equal to its theoretical competitors in illuminating why we have those duties we have. Rule utilitarianism is not equal to this task since, among other reasons, it cannot adequately account for our direct duty not to harm moral patients, or that, apart from testing the theory against our intuitions about such duties, there are independent grounds for recognizing the theory as sound. Rule utilitarians fail to show this, since among many reasons, they fail to show that acceptance of conditional equality commits one to the theory of utilitarianism. Rule utilitarians, in short, have yet to provide compelling reasons to accept their theory, and we have good reasons to reject it. That theory may be simpler than a theory that involves postulating inherent value, but simplicity isn't everything. As to why we should not accept the conditional equality principle, see 8.13. 7.8. Defending the respect principle. In the earlier chapter on ethical theory, a procedure was sketched for testing the validity of alternative ethical principles. We begin with our unexamined moral beliefs, our pre-reflective intuitions, and initiate the process of critical assessment by making a conscientious effort to make an ideal judgment in their case. We strive to be impartial, cool, rational, conceptually clear, and as informed as we can be. Those beliefs that withstand this process of critical evaluation cannot be fairly described as beliefs we just happen to have, or summarily dismissed as prejudices. They are considered beliefs, or intuitions in the reflective sense, beliefs that may then be used as a basis for identifying general moral principles that systematize these intuitions, and as a touchstone against which competing ethical principles can be tested, subject, it will be recalled, to the proviso that some of these beliefs may themselves stand in need of revision or abandonment if they cannot be accounted for by principles shown to be valid in other respects. If we engage in this process of critical reflection, the case can be made for rational acceptance of the respect principle. Among our pre-reflective intuitions are those that concern when it is wrong to harm a moral agent. It is, we believe, unless we have already pledged our allegiance to utilitarianism, wrong to kill a moral agent just so that an optimal balance of intrinsic goods over evils may be secured by all those affected by the outcome. And it is similarly wrong to harm a moral agent in other ways for similar reasons. For example, to cause a moral agent gross suffering, or to deny her the satisfaction of her basic needs, or the opportunities to acquire essential skills on the grounds that this will optimize the balance of good over evil for all affected by the outcome. These are beliefs we hold, not only before, but after we have begun to reflect critically on them, not because of excessive emotional involvement, or because we arbitrarily favor some moral agents, say women or Americans, over others, or because we are fuzzy-minded about the concepts of moral agency or harm, or because we are ill-informed about the relevant facts. Nor can it be claimed that the beliefs are irrational because they lead to inconsistent consequences. These beliefs qualify as considered beliefs, and they should therefore play a legitimate role in the reflective formulation and assessment of alternative ethical principles. Now, the respect principle illuminates and unifies by identifying relevant grounds for these beliefs. That principle requires that we not treat moral agents as if they were mere receptacles of value, lacking any value in their own right. This is what we would be doing if we supposed that the harms done to one moral agent could be justified merely by appealing to the optimal aggregate balance of intrinsic good over intrinsic evil, secured by all those affected by the outcome. The respect principle will not allow this. Those who have inherent value have a kind of value that is distinct from, is not reducible to, and is incommensurate with intrinsic values, either their own intrinsically valuable experiences or those of others. We must treat such individuals with the respect due them, as possessors of such value, and this we will manifestly fail to do if we treat them in ways that could only be justified if moral agents were viewed as something that, given the postulate of inherent value, they are not, namely, as mere receptacles of value, lacking any value in themselves. The respect principle thus both matches and goes some way toward the goal of systematizing our considered beliefs about the wrongness of harming moral agents. One wants more from a moral principle than this, however. There are other relevant criteria, set forth and defended in the earlier chapter on ethical theory, that a valid ethical principle must meet. The respect principle meets them. That principle is consistent, certainly. It does not assert or imply that we can treat some moral agents, for example, Jews, as if they were mere receptacles, while denying that we can do this in the case of others, for example, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It lays down a requirement concerning how any and all moral agents must be treated as a matter of strict justice. Every moral agent is to be given his or her due, and what each is due as a matter of strict justice is the same respectful treatment due any other. The respect principle, therefore, is eminently egalitarian, providing an alternative interpretation of Bentham's declaration that each is to count for one, no one for more than one. Moreover, because this principle applies to our treatment of all moral agents, it has adequate scope. There are literally billions of cases where it daily applies. It does not become operative only, say, when bridge is being played or at high table. As for precision, the respect principle makes clear, intelligible requirements. We are not to treat any moral agent in ways whose possible justification consists merely in appealing to the optimal aggregate consequences that result for all those affected by the outcome. In its present form, it is true, the respect principle provides negative direction only, and by itself, it fails to provide the needed guidance concerning when, and if so, why, it is justifiable to harm a moral agent. These are matters that will concern us in the following chapter. Even in its present form, however, the respect principle meets the relevant criteria for evaluating a moral principle. It is consistent, has adequate scope and precision, and matches a broad range of our reflective intuitions. What its logical status is, that is, whether it is a fundamental or derivative moral principle, remains an open question at this point. On this question, see 8.12. What is not open to serious question is whether, having identified this principle, having explained how it unifies and illuminates our considered beliefs about when it is wrong to harm moral agents in a broad range of cases, having satisfied the legitimate requirements of scope, precision, and consistency, and having done all this in an unemotional, disciplined fashion, in deference to the requirements of impartiality, rationality, and the other conditions that give content to the ideal moral judgment. What is not open to serious question is whether, having done all this, we have failed to take any steps in the direction of justifying acceptance of the respect principle. If the foregoing considerations do not provide good reasons to accept that principle, one can only ask what could provide good reasons for accepting any principle. Respect for moral patience. The interplay between our pre-theoretical beliefs and principles, such as the respect principle, is a two-way street, and we must therefore consider the implications of accepting this principle. This requires asking how other unconsidered beliefs we may happen to have match this principle. In particular, it requires asking whether the scope of the respect principle can be non-arbitrarily limited only to how moral agents may be treated. The arguments of the past 3 chapters provide the grounds for claiming that any and all attempts to limit the scope of the respect principle to moral agents must be deficient. Against indirect duty views, it was argued that we have a direct prima facie duty not to harm moral patients. Thus, we cannot maintain that the respect principle applies only to our dealings with moral agents, on the grounds that A, this principle applies only to how we may treat those individuals to whom we have direct duties, and that B, we have no direct duties to moral patients. Nor can we avoid recognizing that moral patients fall within the principle's scope on the grounds that they have no inherent value, or less inherent value than moral agents. This will not do because attempts to disenfranchise moral patients in this way will lay the groundwork for a perfectionist theory of justice, a theory that will either sanction unjust treatment of some moral agents or avoid this, but only at the price of arbitrariness. To accept the respect principle, in short, commits us to recognizing that it applies also to our dealings with moral patients. They are not to be treated as if they are mere receptacles. We cannot justify harming them merely on the grounds that this will produce an optimal aggregate balance of intrinsic goods over intrinsic evils for all concerned. We owe them respectful treatment, not out of kindness, nor because of sentimental interests of others, but because justice requires it. If our pre-reflective intuitions about how all or some moral patients may be treated happen to differ from how they must be treated if the respect principle is accepted, then these beliefs will have to be changed. Not to change them, given the arguments most recently advanced, and assuming the respect principle is accepted, is to expose oneself to the charge of being prejudiced, and rightly so. These implications of the respect principle, that moral patients generally, and animals in particular, are to be treated with respect, and that respectful treatment is their due as a matter of strict justice, may strike some people as so bizarre that they will want to avoid accepting the respect principle and the postulate of inherent value on which it rests. The cumulative force of the arguments presented in the last 3 chapters is that there is no rational, non-arbitrary way to avoid this principle and this postulate so long as it is reasonable to believe, and reasons have been given to support believing, that it is prima facie wrong to harm moral agents, and that harming them cannot be justified merely on the grounds that this is necessary to bring about optimal aggregate consequences for all concerned. If just this much is accepted, there is no rational, non-arbitrary way to avoid viewing harm done to moral patients in the same way. And once this has been shown, it can then be shown, and has been shown, that the leading attempts to account for this duty without postulating inherent value and without relying on the respect principle must be inadequate, either because they will fail adequately to account for this duty in the case of moral agents, a cardinal failure of act utilitarianism and rational egoism, or because they will fail adequately to account for this duty in the case of moral patients, a singular failure of rule utilitarianism and Rawls's and Kant's positions. And if, finally, we are told to abandon the attempt to validate ethical principles or test ethical theories by having recourse to our reflective intuitions because they are prejudices, or because we can construct a sound ethical theory without relying on them, our reply should be that the former claim simply is untrue, and the latter demonstrably unsubstantiated. For these reasons, then, all of them taken in concert, no one of them taken in isolation from the rest, we have good reason to accept the respect principle, the postulate of inherent value on which it is based, and the full range of implications that flow from their acceptance. 7.9. The derivation of the harm principle. Although its logical status remains an open question at this point, the respect principle clearly is more fundamental than the harm principle, since this latter principle can be derived from the former. On the logical status of the respect principle, see 8.12. The derivation proceeds as follows. The respect principle rests on the postulate of inherent value, and the case has been made for intelligibly and non-arbitrarily viewing all those who satisfy the subject of a life criterion as having value of this kind. Now, those who satisfy this criterion are the subjects of a life that is experientially better or worse for them, logically independently of their utility for others, and their being the object of another's interests. Those who satisfy this condition, in short, are individuals who have an experiential welfare, whose experiential life fares well or ill, depending on what happens to or is done to or for them. The notions of benefit and harm thus apply to our thought and talk about these individuals. Benefits consisting of opportunities for the satisfaction of desires and the fulfillment of purposes that are in the interests of these individuals, and harms being what detract from their individual welfare. Because those who have a welfare, in the sense explained, have inherent value, and because those who have inherent value are owed treatment respectful of this value, those who have a welfare are owed treatment respectful of their distinctive kind of value. Prima facie, therefore, we fail to treat such individuals in ways that respect their value if we treat them in ways that detract from their welfare, that is, in ways that harm them. We have, in short, a prima facie direct duty not to harm those individuals who have an experiential welfare, which is precisely what the harm principle declares. The respect principle, then, not only succeeds in matching our considered beliefs about when it is wrong to harm moral agents, but also provides the basis from which a second moral principle, the harm principle, a principle of direct duty whose validity was defended in an earlier context, can be derived. And that must surely count as an additional point in favor of rational acceptance of the respect principle. To show that the harm principle is derivable from the respect principle is not to show that no matter what the circumstances, it is always wrong to harm another, either a moral agent or a moral patient. This issue will be explored at length in the following chapter. Even at this juncture, however, the following should be clear. Those cases, if any, in which individuals may justifiably be harmed must not contravene the requirement of just treatment set forth by the respect principle. For example, the justification of the harm done cannot rest on the assumption that the harmed individual is a mere receptacle of value, lacking any value in his own right. That would be to treat the harmed individual unjustly because disrespectfully, and no harm done to a moral agent or patient can be justified if it is unjust. 7.10 Summary and Conclusion. The formal principle of justice stipulates that each individual is to be given his or her due. This much is uncontroversial. The controversy begins when we ask what individuals are due. Answers to this question offer normative interpretations or theories of justice. 3 such interpretations were considered. 1. Perfectionism, which holds that what individuals are due depends on the degree to which they possess certain virtues, for example, intellectual skills. 2. Utilitarianism, which holds that what individuals are due is equal consideration of their interests, or pleasures, etc. And 3. The equality of individuals view, which holds that what individuals are due is equal respect for their equal inherent value. Perfectionism was rejected because it would justify the unjust exploitation of the less virtuous, for example, the less intelligent, by the more virtuous. And utilitarian interpretations were rejected because they either fail to account for the full range of the wrongful acts that may be done to moral agents, a central defect urged against act utilitarianism in an earlier chapter, or because they fail to account for the full range of our direct duties to moral patients, a central defect of rule utilitarianism. The equality of individuals interpretation overcomes these defects, first because all those individuals who have inherent value have it equally, thus the unsavory implications of perfectionism are avoided, and because, second, we would fail to show respect for the inherent value individuals possess if we were to treat them in the ways that act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism would sanction or require. The notion of inherent value was explained. Those who have value of this kind are more than receptacles of the value that attaches to their experiences, the view of individuals and their value, or lack of value, common to all forms of utilitarianism. Inherent value is distinct from, not reducible to, and incommensurate with intrinsic values, for example, pleasure. The postulate of inherent value must be defended on theoretical grounds, and the attempt was made to offer such a justification. If we do not make this postulate, it was argued, we will be unable to account for our considered beliefs, our reflective intuitions, about when it is wrong to harm either moral agents or moral patients. Though this postulate will oblige us to construct a less simple theory than some, for example, utilitarianism, that is a price we must be willing to pay if we are to have the most adequate theory, all considered. To deny that moral patients have inherent value, or to affirm that they have less inherent value than moral agents, it was argued, is arbitrary. All animals are equal is true when understood in context. The question of the relevant similarities shared by all those who have equal inherent value was addressed. This similarity cannot be, say, some physical characteristic or some biological fact, for example, species membership. The view that it is being alive was considered and rejected, and the subject of a life criterion was clarified and defended. Individuals are subjects of a life if they are able to perceive and remember, if they have beliefs, desires, and preferences, if they are able to act intentionally in pursuit of their desires or goals, if they are sentient and have an emotional life, if they have a sense of the future, including a sense of their own future, if they have a psychophysical identity over time, and if they have an individual experiential welfare that is logically independent of their utility for and the interests of others. This criterion is a sufficient condition for making attributions of inherent value intelligible and non-arbitrary. Whether it is a necessary condition was left an open question. As a matter of strict justice, then, we are required to give equal respect to those individuals who have equal inherent value, whether they be moral agents or moral patients, and if the latter, whether they be humans or animals. That is something each is due. Injustice arises when we treat those who have such value in ways that fail to display proper respect. For example, by treating them as if their value was reducible to their utility for others. The harm principle, a principle that sets forth a prima facie direct duty not to harm either moral agents or patients, is derivable from the respect principle, when we note that 1. Those individuals who satisfy the subject of a life criterion are individuals who are intelligibly and non-arbitrarily viewed as meriting respect because they are intelligibly and non-arbitrarily viewed as possessing inherent value, and that 2. As subjects of a life, all have an experiential welfare. Prima facie, therefore, we fail to show respect for these individuals when we do anything that harms them. Whether, and if so, how the duty not to harm these individuals may be justifiably overridden are issues that remain to be examined. But no harm done to moral agents or patients can be justified if it is unjust. No harm can be justified, accordingly, if it contravenes the respect principle, treating the harmed individuals as mere receptacles of value or as things whose value is reducible to their utility relative to the interests of others.